welcome back to Season 4 of Undermine. I'm Tom Marshall, and I'll be your tour guide, your Phish tour guide, as we travel back in time to Destination 1.0. This season, we'll be revisiting 25 monumental shows from the 90s on Phish's road to fall 1997, which was the tour that changed everything. Then we'll discuss every single show of that tour as we relive the season when Phish destroyed America. Think of it as color commentary or the director's cut as our entire community celebrates the 25th anniversary of that historic tour. My co-host for today is fellow Undermine executive producer, artist, manager, and New York Times bestselling author, Benji Eisen. Hi, Benji.
Hi, Tom. I have to tell you, I am really excited to have our specific special guest on today because the show that we're about to talk about, Stowe, Vermont, from July 25th, 1992, is one of those shows that I think every 1.0 fan has heard. And I'm not sure if more modern fans from the 3.0 era on necessarily have heard it or even heard of it. But when I became a fan, it was one of those shows like Amy's Farm that just everybody, you at least knew of it. It's only one set and it's only an hour long. And the first half of it is actually typical showcase Phish or festival Phish. You know, the band was opening for Santana. And so therefore they were playing to a much larger audience than they were used to. Most of whom, or many of whom at least, had likely never heard the band before, maybe not even heard of them. And, you know, this was a national tour, but then, of course, this particular show is back on Phish's, home base. And the band reacts to the Santana opening sets by playing their showcase tunes, of the era. So this night it was Runaway Jim, Foam, Sparkle, Stash, Rift. And of course, we all know those songs by heart. And Tom, you know those songs by heart because, well, you wrote most of them. but they were standard fare. They all were in heavy rotation at the time. And Phish played them that night with that, the impressive oomph and that impossible precision that is so indicative of early 90s Phish. But they didn't really take any risks or deviate from the prototype. Because I think it's showcase Phish where they're just trying to put their best foot forward. But then, halfway through this show, about a half hour into it, the band has some special guests join them. They have a pair of percussion players from Santana's band, Carlo Perazzo and Raul Ricao, and, oh yeah, Carlos Santana himself. So, there's the legendary Santana, there's the local band from Burlington, and there's Trey trading lits with Carlos on You Enjoy Myself, Llama, and Funky Bitch. I think, if Trey's recent sit-in with Juice was seen as some kind of induction for that band, then, which is whether or not that's true is another thing, but it was seen as that, perceived as that by a large portion of the fan base. And I think he could, in a way, draw a parallel and say that this moment had, some kind of coronation for Phish. Was there a torch? I suspect we'll get to that. But first, as your co-host, Tom, one of my responsibilities is to take this moment to remind our listeners that, hey, if you like what you're hearing, then please consider subscribing to Osiris Premium on Apple, where you'll get ad-free podcasts, you'll get bonus episodes, and more. Okay, Tom, tell us about our guest today.
Well, first of all, Benji, thank you always for remembering to do that because we'll get arrested if we don't say that. So thank you. Well, our guest today is the famous Shelly Culbertson. Shelly was one of the early Phish employees. We used to call it the front office, and Shelly worked, and she'll tell us probably what she did, but we saw her on the road. We saw her in Vermont at the office, and she just was everywhere. And she and I go way back. We were both fans, of course, of early Phish, but we were also involved with the band in different ways. And I think I got a couple of those details from Shelly a few years ago for Under the Scales, but certainly for Undermine not too long ago. And Shelly, I recall you were, like I said, the front office doing administration of various tours, and we're going to bring her on in a minute. She's in the waiting room. But I also remember, and I want to thank you for helping me with tickets and stuff. And, well, let's just say it. Welcome back, Shelly. Here she is, Shelly Culbertson. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you doing?
Doing great. We understand you're in Nevada right now. Is that right?
Yes, it is Nevada. Yep, that's right. Here in Reno, Northern Nevada.
Okay, great.
Shelly, it has been many years since we first met, and it's been lifetimes since we actually last talked directly. But I wanted to thank you for all your kindness to me when I was just a young, starry-eyed Phish fan. Back in 1.0 days, I was attempting to go to college between Phish tours, between Phish shows, and trying with varying degrees of success to take my obsession with this band as inspiration for the life ahead of me. I spent all of my free time back then in the computer lab learning and writing about and discussing this band with the then burgeoning online community. And you took notice and you helped me out. You assisted me on my journey. Sometimes you hooked up tickets. Sometimes you even hooked up after show stickies. And I'll never forget those nights. So thank you. But enough fanfare. Tom,
it's very sweet of you to remember all that. It's funny to think so far back, because you're right, it was lifetimes ago. And in some ways, the world was very small then, when all of those of us who are actually, participating in the internet and whatnot, and also seeing each other at shows, could keep track of each other to some extent. And then the world got very big, and now it feels like the world has gotten both very big and very small at the same time. When we connect with those folks who were, part of it all back then.
Yeah.
Well, I'll never forget those nights. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, similar to what Benji said, anytime we mention that we're going to have Shelly Culbertson on, or previously on other podcasts, everyone has this similar type of memory, is that you were always super kind to people. And I think you had some internet chops, which is why, Phish, the internet was brand new, Phish was brand new, and here you were able to kind of bridge the gap a little bit. You were a fan that had internet chops. And why don't you fill us in on when you started working for Phish and in what capacity, in a nutshell, if that's okay.
Sure. And I think maybe I could just sum up my role as mayonnaise, like trying to make things go together. But yeah, I started as a fan, like many people did. I first heard of the band on the internet, so that's not really a coincidence, I would say. Back in the early days of the internet, I know that's been, or not the internet itself, but the internet as something that could be used by folks who were doing something other than just pure science, et cetera. And I know that's a topic that could be a long conversation and has been covered elsewhere. But that is how I first became acquainted with them, both just listening as a fan and had the, boldness to approach them and ask them to do interviews with me in those early days. And that's how we became acquainted. And then John Paluska was looking to hire someone to work with him full time. This would have been late in 1992. So really just about a year after I had first met them. And since we'd already had some contact, I was certainly interested and applied. And that's how I began working for Dionysian Productions early in 1993. And at that time, the responsibilities were kind of as broad as they needed to be, because there weren't a lot of folks working in the office. And, certainly John was very busy. I was the first full-time employee after that. So it was just kind of trying to keep track of all the things that needed to be done and getting them done. And a lot of it had to do with touring logistics and things like that. But it was a nice opportunity to kind of have a broad view of all of the operational needs at that early point in time.
So I guess this show then, Stowe, Vermont, took place shortly before you became a full-time employee, but it was a very important show in Phish history, more for the significance of it than for the actual music. You know, opening up for the iconic Carlos Santana, it really put Phish on a map that, you know, beyond Burlington, Boston, Telluride, and these little pockets that they had developed on their own. Did you see it like that at the time? Do you remember?
I remember that it was certainly exciting to see them in a setting that was bigger than the clubs and the places that I had seen them in up to that point. I'd been to probably, you know, less than 10 or approximately 10 shows at about the time we're talking about. I wasn't at the actual show in Stowe, but I was at one about a month later. That was also part of that same tour at the Greek Theater in LA. So that's, you know, what I'll be basing my recollections on. And really interesting from a variety of reasons. You know, West Coast shows where I started were smaller at the time. First place I saw them would have had about a 400 capacity in Arcata. So then, you know, going from there, that fall I had seen them at Somerville Theater, which is a really high energy venue in the Boston area. So then moving from that level of large theater to these outdoor amphitheater style spaces where they were opening for Santana, much bigger space, much more, you know, polished kind of large event experience, you know, but at the same time, when they were playing in that opening time slot, the energy wasn't as concentrated because there were still people filtering in. So it was very different from seeing them playing their own shows, even in those smaller spaces. And I kind of feel like that must have made an impression on them as well, both being eager for the opportunity to play to new people and create an impression, but at the same time, not having that same sense of intimacy and that same sense of the whole venue filled up with people and energy during the time that they were playing their set. You know, there would be the hardcore Phish fans who were there first and foremost for them, and, you know, and then would stay on to enjoy Santana as well. But that was definitely a smaller group. So it was a very different experience from what the shows I'd seen prior to that tour.
Right. This one in particular kind of stands out. I mean, this wasn't the only show they played with Santana. And then later, of course, I was along with them for a tour where several bands opened, sort of rotated opening for Santana in Europe, and that was amazing. But this one, they were like special guest openers for a mini tour of Santana, but I think this was the only one that Santana sat in. And you can just hear, it's like halfway through You Enjoy Myself, I think it's like 8 minutes and 40 seconds. All of a sudden, there's this other guitar, and it's kind of neat because they sort of start blending into each other. Where Trey and Carlos are trading licks, and they do sound similar in many ways. But I think Benji sort of referred to it like they didn't want to. They were putting their best foot forward. They didn't want to misstep. And I'm wondering if I know you said you weren't at this show, but do you think it was like nervous anticipation or just all-out excitement or combination happening with Phish on stage at that moment?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question. And honestly, it'd be interesting to go back and listen to like multiple opening sets, you know, during that time period and to compare them, because I'm sure there was probably a bit of an evolution in how they approached that, you know, it was a fairly short time slot, you know, was not more than an hour and probably less, I think, throughout most of those opening sets. You may know better than me. So, you know, presumably they had a lot to say in a small amount of time in which to say it, you know. So as that time passed, let's say from July, you know, to August, in those opening sets, they probably managed to find different ways to make the best use of that time. And like you said, Tom, sometimes there was probably both a lot of energy, but also kind of a sense of caution as they work to fit their set into that, because that's a small box for them at that point, going from 3.5 hours approximately between two sets to 45 minutes to an hour. It's like taking your 10,000 word paper and turning it into a Twitter statement.
Yeah, there's something about it that reminds me of when they play festivals as well, where they're trying to show off their compositions, and they have so many different sides of them that they're trying to they really just want to say, here's who we are, before taking a deep dive. This is our who we are as a band. Do you remember, tell me, especially it's interesting with you going, working for them full time in 1993, which would be sort of seeing the results of this tour. Do you think that, was Phish a bigger band after this tour? Was there, do you think exposure to Carlos Santana's audience paid off in a measurable way?
I'm sure it made a difference, but I think there were so many factors at play at that time that probably the actual, I don't doubt that people who weren't familiar with Phish and who first saw them because of the fact that they were going to see Santana and Phish played as well, I'm sure that created some significant impressions, but I feel like there were so many other things happening at the same time too. The internet would be the one that I would be most aware of, and folks who were going to see them playing their own shows. And again, kind of like I mentioned earlier, probably a significant number of folks who wanted to see Phish who went to those combination Phish Santana shows with their first objective as being to see Phish. So it's really hard to say how much effect that had on the growth of their audience in terms of the new people who were exposed to them. But it probably, I would think, had an effect on them professionally in terms of having a new level of exposure to all of the logistics of putting on shows in those larger venues and what went along with that. So kind of being a logical stepping stone towards the future that they were clearly headed towards, where they'd be playing those same places within a few years as a headliner.
Well, that's really interesting, because I never thought of it from that perspective. But from an organizational standpoint, of course, it's kind of showing you the ropes in a way. And yeah, I never thought of it like that. I was always focused more on the audience and the growth. But Phish were kind of unstoppable in that period, regardless of if they landed a great opening package tour or not. Shelly, we have a bunch more questions for you. But first, I have to turn to our listeners to tell them that if you're a premium subscriber, you get to pass Joe right now and collect $200 Monopoly dollars. But for everybody else on the GA lawn, stick around, because we'll be right back after this quick break.
Have you ever wondered what it would feel like if your investments reflected what matters most to you? At Green Future Wealth Management, the advisors specialize in helping clients manifest their values in their financial lives. Green Future Wealth Management was founded by certified financial planner practitioner and longtime fan Nick Cantrell, named by Forbes as one of the top next-gen wealth advisors in the country. Whether you are just getting started or have complex investing and financial planning needs, visit them on the web at greenfuturewealth.com. You can sign up for the email list or take the Investing Values quiz. When you feel ready, schedule a free virtual consultation. In appreciation for the amazing Phish community and the incredible work being done by fans across the country, Green Future Wealth Management will be donating 10% of asset management proceeds from new Osiris listener clients to Fans for Racial Equity. Just be sure to mention Osiris when booking your appointment. Create your green future. Securities offered through Cambridge Investment Research Inc., member FINRA/SIPC. Advisory services offered through Cambridge Investment Research Advisors Inc. Cambridge and Green Future Wealth are not affiliated.
And we're back. I'm Tom Marshall, here with my co-host for this episode, Benji Eisen, and our special guest, the lovely Shelly Culbertson, a Phish Incorporated alumni. Phish Inc., as we used to call. Shelly, thanks again for joining us, but let me ask you, as kind of a do-everything person in the front office with just you and Paluska at the time, you must have come across this thing that something you said jostled in my memory, and I know I don't quite have it right, but I believe it might have been just a Rolling Stone interview with Carlos, where someone said something about Trey, and he said, yes, I love playing with Trey. He's a very soulful player, and I remember one time looking over at him. He gets so into his playing that one time on stage I looked over at him and there was this big string of drool connecting his mouth and his guitar, and he goes, and that was the moment that I was like, yeah, this guy's great. That was like his stamp of approval. Do you remember where that interview occurred? I'd like to find that again.
I don't. If I come across it, I will let you know.
Okay, I'm going to look for it and post it up with this episode when it comes out, if I can find it. But we're talking about this time period basically in the summer of '92, and you were just sort of getting started. Maybe next year, this is Phish and Santana. Big act. Is there anything, not just specifically about Santana, but anything about Phish's growth spurt that kind of came right after this? Was there a feeling among the crew and the staff that, hey, this is working, we're really doing it? Like, you were right in there at the beginning of this huge growth spurt.
I mean, absolutely. There was a sense of energy and energy building that seemed pretty phenomenal and, undeniable at the time. And I don't think that feeling kind of really never let up for pretty much the whole time that I was with Phish, which kind of it really was. I mean, the culmination of that would have been Big Cypress, which was kind of the last Phish shows, really, that I was really involved in. And one of the things that I remember that I think is kind of interesting in the context of what we've been talking about, that I think was a very intelligent and correct strategy. We've been talking about John Paluska. He was very deliberate and very selective about the venues where the band would play. Because it was important usually for them to be in spaces that would be full and where that energy could build and where everyone could feel the excitement of being inside and being part of the experience. So they tended to be venues that were likely to sell out in advance, which, was a really good plan, I think, for that point, because it kept the excitement level high and it kept people kind of hungry for more, and so I see that those experiences of the opening for Santana and how they fit into that picture as well, because it was a very easy illustration of kind of the difference between, again, playing in a place with a small number of engaged people, but a large place versus a small to medium sized place packed to the rafters with engaged people. And then just kind of expanding those walls outward as the years pass, but continuing to keep that level of energy just as intense, even as the rooms got bigger, and even as the outdoor spaces got bigger to the point where there's, hundreds of thousands of people in Florida.
Yeah, exactly. Talking with Paluska a little bit earlier, he was our first episode of this season. you know, a lot of us follow Phish on tour, and so we get to see a gradual increase of these venues and stuff. But think of it from the standpoint of the local people. Here comes Phish, and now they're in a small room. Here comes Phish again, now they're in a bigger room. Here comes Phish again. It was incredible from the fan standpoint watching that happen, you know, when they came through, you know, the 3 states that I would see almost every single show in, just watching every single time growing all throughout the 90s. It was unbelievable.
You know, that brings up a good point. You know, Shelly, you mentioned Big Cypress, which is all obviously, you know, the penultimate in many ways. But were there any other shows that maybe you were involved with that you can think of off the top of your head where the stakes felt high because of the high profile, you know, exposure? Like opening for Santana at that point, that was oh my goodness, like we're opening for this, you know, icon. And then, of course, you know, some festivals and things like that. And like I said, Big Cypress was its own thing. But were there any other shows where you thought, you know, you looked out at the audience and you thought, like, this is a big moment. This is really, you know, important for the band?
Well, I mean, certainly Madison Square Garden always felt that way, especially like the early trips to the Garden, even though, you know, throughout the time I was with them and thereafter, I mean, that's clearly become a second home, you know, to them, or a first home maybe. But so that would be one place where it always felt extra special. But I mean, another experience I remember, it wasn't precisely a show, but not long after I began working for them, they were nominated for an award, you know, in Boston. I want to say it's called the Boston Music Awards, I think. And, you know, and we all went. And like one thing that was exciting about that night, there's this row of empty seats in front of us, and we're looking at them and kind of joking with each other, like Aerosmith's going to come in and sit there. And then they did. So that was kind of funny. But I think even from that point on, like, it was almost like so many amazing things were happening that it was hard to be too amazed by anything because it was almost all amazing all the time. But that being said, you know, Madison Square Garden is special.
Great answer.
Yeah.
Up to you, Benji. Keep going.
Okay. This is a Matt moment. We'll edit. Okay. You know, Shelly, last year I had the chance to work with Carlos Santana for just one day because we did a Billy and the Kids live stream. We taped it in Hawaii, and he played with the band for a day, and you know, he sat us down in between tapes and would play us jazz music and you know, talked about how he wanted to make timeless music. But he talked, you know, it was with Bill Kreutzmann, who was kind of his equal from being in the Grateful Dead, but he was more interested in the younger players, I think. And he had this, you know, he had undeniably magical musical moments with with Aaron Magner, with Billy Strings. But Carlos felt some type of immediate and obvious connection with James Casey, which was pretty cool because James Casey also, of course, plays in Trey's solo band. But it was really cool to see they did call and response and with the cameras not rolling, you know, and Carlos kind of just had this like paternal, he wanted to like bring James in and sort of not guide him, but it was just sort of this like, you know, incredible exchange. During the Santana Phish shows, do you think that, you know, did you witness or hear of or know of any like teacher-student interactions with Carlos and Trey?
That isn't something that I had any direct awareness of, although, you know, undoubtedly that, you know, would have been present in some way. And, you know, even, you know, probably in just musical communication versus like verbal communication, you know.
I have one direct one. If I could interrupt with an actual one that popped into my head, which is, and this was later. This was on the European tour, the tour that Carlos kept bumping into me and saying, "You're the only guy on tour that's not working." And I said, "I'm the lyricist, man. Come on, I'm working all the time."
Right. It's all research.
Yeah. But no, Trey told me that Carlos said to him, "You got to keep in mind that out here, you're treated like a king. People bring you your food. You're cheered when you walk on stage." And he said, "But you got to go home and take out the trash like everyone else, and remember where that you're grounded in reality. Don't let this be your reality, because there's another reality that you have to keep in mind." And Trey said that was incredible advice. Incredible advice.
Tom, I'm really glad that you brought up the European tour, because Shelly, as Phish went back out with Santana in 1996 across all these European markets, including stadiums. And that is 1996 would be the same year that Phish really became an arena band on a national level back in the States. Was the goal to open up Europe in 1996 the same way that, the 1992 tour maybe opened up parts of the US to Phish, from a growth perspective, and did it work?
Yeah, I think that, definitely was exactly as you described, a good opportunity to begin having some Phish shows available to people in Europe. I think in general with music, the degree to which there is or isn't crossover between with the same artists and their audiences in Europe versus North America, it remains an interesting topic, and that could be a whole conversation in and of itself. But, definitely, for a lot of reasons, that was a good way to get a start in Europe. I didn't go to any of those shows, but I did go. The year is going to escape me, but there was a tour after that where Phish was playing smaller places in Europe, but on their own, not as an opening band, where I went to a number of the shows. And so it was also interesting, even if you look at it geographically, Northeast United States versus West Coast United States, then shifting to Europe, it's kind of a similar path, but just on a different timeline in the different places internationally. I'm not really sure that the growth in Europe ever reached the same level that it has in the US, but also at a certain point, it's cool to have those experiences, but it also becomes not a necessity. It's just kind of more of a nice to have, like to be able to have that international aspect to the touring schedule and the audiences and to be welcoming to people everywhere if they want to be interested. But, at the same time, I don't think it ever developed in Europe the way that it did in North America, US.
I think what I'm hearing you say, Shelly, and it's a direct message to Phish, is that you expect them to tour in Europe soon. That's what I'm hearing. And other important things that I think I heard you guys say directly to the audience are to listen to this show. This show, and I went back to study, and I think I'd only heard it in probably once in my entire life. I was never a big tape collector. So 7/25/92. If you listen, if you're only going to listen to a couple songs, start with You Enjoy Myself. When you hear Carlos come on, and also, of course, the percussionists, it's incredible. There's instead of a vocal jam, there's a percussion jam, and it's 3 percussionists. Phish is probably can't believe what's happening with those 2 amazing Latin American percussion people on stage with him. And we saw it later, of course, with the Remain in Light with Carl Perazzo again on tour with Phish. But Llama and Funky Bitch also, Carlos's playing is stellar, and the way that Trey interacts with him and the way that they interact with the band is unbelievable. Anything else, Benji?
No, I mean, you heard that Phish is going back to Europe is what you took from it. And what I took from it is that, like the Grateful Dead, Phish is an American band. But yeah, no, the other thing about this particular show that is so cool is that, you can really hear, because of the tone, you can hear the difference. I mean, Santana is one of those players like Trey is, where one note on any guitar and you know who's playing it.
Yeah, he could play the worst guitar with the worst amp, and you'd know it was Carlos Santana.
That's right.
Yep.
That's right.
I'm going to have to squeeze one more thing in here, at least, which is that one Phish Santana show that I went to. I do remember that there was some turmoil that night because Trey had changed the tubes in his Mesa Boogie amplifier. Maybe I'm not really sure what conversations led to that occurrence, but it didn't necessarily have the effect that he was looking for. And then there was some time and energy spent to restore everything back to its prior state. But I would guess that it would be interesting to do a side-by-side listening test of, I'm going to say it was 8/15/92 at the Greek in LA, because you were talking about that tone of one note on a guitar that by which, in a second you could immediately identify Carlos Santana. It'd be interesting to listen to some of the tones of single notes on the guitar from that set with the different tube configuration in that Mesa Boogie amp, because I think there's an audible difference.
There it is. Well, that's all we have time for today. But I'd like to thank our guest, Shelly Culbertson, for joining us and giving us that homework assignment. We have a listening assignment we have to do. My co-host, Benji Eisen, for all his work. And, of course, all of you for listening. And remember to review and subscribe wherever you listen or watch. On the next episode, we're going to be traveling through time and space to Atlanta in February '93. For a night that is still celebrated among Phish fans to this very day. We'll reconvene then, and in the days between, keep calm and blaze on. Thank you again, Shelly.
Thank you, Shelly.
Thank you.
Osiris.